All right, so today we're going to be diving into Apache Flink.
Okay.
And you know how these days everybody relies on apps for just about everything, like whether you're catching a ride or you're trying to figure out what to watch?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Flink is often the engine that's sort of running behind the scenes, and it's especially important when it comes to real-time data.
Right.
So we're going to take a look at how it does all that, and we're going to be using information from the official Apache Flink website
Okay.
and a really cool YouTube video that I found from Confluent.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's great.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting about Flink is that it's not just processing data fast. It's actually able to remember data, which allows it to make like smarter decisions in the moment.
Oh, interesting.
And this stateful computation, as it's called, is what makes it possible for, your ride-sharing app to give you a really accurate ETA based on the current traffic conditions or, how your streaming service knows to recommend shows based on what you've watched before.
So it's not just speed, it's like actual intelligence.
Exactly.
That's really cool. The Apache Flink website has all these different use cases on there. But I'm kind of curious, what's the real-world impact of this technology? How does this actually affect people?
Well, you can think about fraud detection.
Okay.
So, with the old batch processing, banks would have to wait until the end of the day to analyze transactions.
Okay.
But Flink lets them flag suspicious activity right when it happens.
Oh, wow.
Which can potentially save you from a really bad financial headache.
Yeah, that's great.
And this real-time capability is a game changer, across all industry.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the Confluent video actually made a really interesting comparison between this real-time processing and the traditional batch processing.
Oh, right.
How would you describe that?
Yeah, it's the difference between waiting for all your mail to come at the end of the day before you can sort through it.
Okay.
Versus sorting it as it comes in.
I see.
So, with real-time processing, you can act on information right away.
So it's about being more proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. The video also got into Flink's architecture, and it was talking about the job manager and task managers. And I have to admit, that part was a little bit over my head.
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. If you think about it like an orchestra,
right?
The job manager is the conductor, and it coordinates all the different parts. And then the task managers are the musicians. They're each responsible for playing their part of the musical score,
Right.
which in this case is the data processing task.
That's a really good analogy. I like that a lot. But for those of us who aren't super hardcore programmers, is Flink something that regular people can use?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Flink has a bunch of different language options for its API.
Good.
So, if you're comfortable with SQL or Java or Python, you can totally work with it.
Oh, cool.
It's made to be developer friendly no matter what your background is.
That's really good to know. Now, the Confluent video also talked about Flink's relationship with Apache Kafka.
Right.
Can you sort of break down how those two work together?
Yeah. So if you think about it a factory production line, Kafka is the conveyor belt. It brings in all the raw materials, so your data from, all these different sources.
Okay.
And then Flink takes over as the processing stations, and it transforms that raw data into valuable insights.
That's cool.
So they work really well together.
You're like a dynamic duo. I like that. So now we're talking about not just processing the data, but actually getting insights that you can use in real time, which is really cool.
Yeah, exactly. And the applications are super diverse.
Yeah.
The Apache Flink website mentions event-driven applications.
What does that actually mean?
So basically it means building apps that can react to events as they're happening.
Okay.
Instead of waiting for a batch job to run.
Okay.
Imagine a retailer is using Flink to track online purchases. They can instantly see if there's a big spike in demand for a certain product.
Wow.
And then they can adjust their inventory or their marketing campaigns to match that.
So it's like having your finger on the pulse at all times.
Exactly.
That's really cool. Now, the website also mentioned something called stream and batch analytics.
Right.
Can you explain the difference between those two?
So imagine you're a marketing manager and you're looking at sales data.
Okay.
Batch analytics is looking at a monthly report. You get a snapshot of the past performance, but it's not live.
I see.
But stream analytics with Flink is watching a live feed of your sales data.
Oh, wow.
You can see trends and weird stuff happening as it happens.
She can react a lot quicker.
Exactly.
Oh, it's awesome. So Flink can handle both historical analysis and real-time insights.
Yeah.
Wow, so you really get like a full picture of your data.
Precisely, and that's where Flink's architecture is really great.
Okay.
It can handle both bounded and unbounded data sets, so it can process like those static snapshots of data, like your monthly sales reports, and also continuous streams of information like live website traffic.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
But I imagine managing Flink, especially when you get to a really large scale, could get really complicated.
Yeah, you're right.
How do you even begin to do that?
Well, distributing those computations across a whole bunch of machines, making sure that if one fails, the whole thing doesn't crash.
Right.
And then scaling the resources up and down as needed.
That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, it definitely requires some specialized expertise.
So for companies that don't have like that kind of expertise in-house,
right.
What are their options?
Well, that's where like cloud-based managed Flink services come in.
Okay.
So these services let companies like rent a Flink cluster in the cloud without having to deal with like setting it up or managing it themselves.
So it's like outsourcing that expertise.
Exactly.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah.
But for those developers who are like, ready to get their hands dirty, the Confluent video mentioned that Flink's API is available in like a whole bunch of languages.
Yeah, that's
So is there a difference, like if you choose one language over another?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I'm always a little skeptical when a tool says like, oh yeah, we can do all these things equally well.
Sure.
Like, is there a trade-off if you choose like the Python API versus the Java API?
So all of the Flink APIs can do the core functions.
Okay.
But there are some things to think about. The Java API is generally seen as the most mature and feature-rich. It gives you like the most control and flexibility.
I see.
But Python might be better for people who are coming from like a data science background.
Okay.
Because it's easier to use, and there are tons of libraries already available in the Python world.
So it really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're comfortable with.
Exactly. It's good to have options.
Yeah, for sure.
The Confluent video also mentioned that managing Flink at a large scale can be tough.
Yes.
Even with those managed cloud services that we talked about.
What are some of the like biggest challenges that companies run into?
Resource management is a big one.
Okay.
Figuring out how to scale your Flink cluster up and down as your data needs change can be tricky.
That makes sense.
You got to make sure you have enough power to deal with those like peak loads, but you also don't want to spend a ton of money on resources that you're not using.
Right, of course.
Another challenge is like monitoring and debugging. When you have like a really complex Flink application running across a bunch of different machines, finding and fixing problems can be hard.
So it sounds like managing Flink at that scale really needs a certain amount of expertise.
Yeah.
Even if you have help from the cloud providers.
Yeah, that's true.
Are there any like best practices or tools out there that can help companies with this stuff?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Okay, good.
There are lots of monitoring tools that are made just for Flink.
Okay.
And they can give you a ton of info about how your application is performing, which can help you figure out where the bottlenecks are and how to use your resources better.
Right.
There's also a huge community of Flink experts out there.
Awesome.
And they share their knowledge and best practices online and at conferences and stuff.
That's great to hear. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
I
wanted to circle back to something we talked about earlier, those event-driven applications.
Right.
The Apache Flink website gives a few examples. But I'm curious, what are some like less conventional, maybe even unexpected uses for Flink in this area?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
One area where I think Flink could have a really big impact is in the world of like personalized experiences.
Okay.
Like imagine a retail store using Flink to analyze customer behavior as it's happening.
Okay.
So as you're walking through the store, Flink is tracking your movements, what you pick up, even like your facial expressions, to create a super personalized shopping experience.
That's wild.
Yeah.
It's kind of creepy, but also kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What about other industries like entertainment or gaming?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
How could you use it there?
Flink could be used to make like interactive gaming experiences that change based on what the player's doing.
Okay.
So, it could adjust the difficulty level or like throw in new challenges or even change the story based on the player's choices.
Wow.
And in the entertainment industry, Flink could be used to like personalize content recommendations or adjust ad placements on the fly.
That makes sense.
Or even power like interactive live streaming experiences.
So Flink is not just about processing data, it's about opening up all these new ways of interacting with the world.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. And speaking of interactive experiences,
Yes.
we want to make sure that our listeners are fully engaged with our podcast.
Absolutely.
So before we move on to the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we want to remind you to subscribe to our channel and leave us a comment with your thoughts.
We really appreciate your feedback and tell us what you found most interesting.
Yeah.
And what questions you still have or, what other cool topics you might want us to dive into in future episodes.
And hey, if you're feeling extra nice, a like would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
It really helps more people find our podcast and join the conversation.
First,
Now let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some of the ethical things to think about when it comes to real-time data processing.
okay, sounds good. Okay, so we're back and ready to really get into how Flink handles those stateful computations.
All right.
And remember, this ability to remember past data is what makes Flink so powerful when it comes to making those real-time decisions.
Right. It's not just about looking at each piece of data on its own. It's about seeing how they all fit together over time.
Exactly.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around how this statefulness actually works in the real world.
Sure.
Can you give me another example?
So imagine you're building an app to monitor traffic patterns in a city.
Oh.
If you only looked at how many cars were passing a sensor at any given moment, you'd miss a lot of important information about traffic flow.
Right.
But if you use Flink to maintain state, you can actually track how the number of cars is changing over time.
Oh, I see.
So you can identify congestion points, predict traffic jams, and even optimize the timing of traffic lights.
So it's about seeing those trends and patterns that emerge over time.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. But I imagine keeping track of all that state can get really complicated, especially with huge amounts of data.
That's true. Managing state effectively is one of the biggest challenges in real-time data processing.
Yeah.
But Flink has built-in mechanisms that help handle that complexity.
Okay.
It can actually distribute state across multiple machines.
Oh, wow.
So even if one machine crashes, you don't lose any data.
That's a relief.
And your application doesn't go down.
Right. So it sounds like Flink is built to handle a lot of the behind-the-scenes work.
Yes.
So developers don't have to worry about all the complexities of managing that state themselves.
Exactly.
That's great.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about Flink's API.
Okay.
The fact that it's available in different languages is awesome. But are there any differences in functionality or performance depending on which API you choose?
That's a great question.
I'm always a little suspicious when a tool says it can do all these different things equally well. Is there a trade-off if you pick, say, the Python API over the Java API?
So while all the Flink APIs give you access to the core functionality, there are some things to consider.
Okay.
The Java API is generally considered to be the most mature and feature-rich.
Okay.
It gives you the most control and flexibility.
I see.
But Python might be easier for people coming from a data science background because it's more user-friendly, and there are a lot of libraries available in Python.
So it really depends on what you need and what you're comfortable with.
You have options.
Yeah, that's good. Speaking of options, the Confluent video talked about how managing Flink at a really large scale can be a challenge,
Right.
even with those managed cloud services.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific challenges that companies face?
Well, one of the biggest is resource management.
Okay.
Scaling a Flink cluster up and down to meet changing data demands can be tough.
Right.
You need to make sure you have enough resources to handle those peak loads, but you also don't want to overspend on capacity you're not using. It's a delicate balance.
It is.
Yeah.
Another big challenge is monitoring and debugging.
Okay.
When you've got a complex Flink application running on multiple machines, it can be difficult to find and fix problems.
That sounds pretty intense.
It can be.
So managing Flink at scale really seems to require a certain level of expertise,
Yeah. Yeah.
even with help from cloud providers.
Yes.
Are there any best practices or tools that can help companies with all this?
Definitely, there are a lot of monitoring tools specifically designed for Flink.
Oh, okay.
These tools can give you really valuable insights into how your application is performing, helping you identify bottlenecks and use resources more efficiently.
That's good.
And there's a large and active community of Flink experts who are always sharing their knowledge and best practices online and at conferences.
That's awesome. Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to those event-driven applications.
The Apache Flink website gives a few examples, but I'm curious about some less conventional or maybe even unexpected uses for Flink in this area.
That's a really interesting question.
What do you think?
One area where I see Flink having a big impact is in personalized experiences.
Okay.
Like, Imagine a retail store using Flink to analyze customer behavior in real time.
Okay, we talked about that a little bit.
Right. But think about it as you're browsing the aisles. Flink could be tracking your every move.
Oh,
The items you pick up, even your facial expressions.
that's wild.
Yeah, and all that to create a highly personalized shopping experience.
That's both fascinating and a little creepy.
It is, isn't it?
What about other industries like entertainment or gaming?
Oh, absolutely. Flink could be used to create interactive games that adapt to the player's behavior. So it could adjust the difficulty level, introduce new challenges, even change the story based on the player's choices.
Wow, that's really cool.
And in the entertainment industry,
Yeah.
it could personalize content recommendations, adjust ad placements dynamically,
Okay.
or even power interactive live streaming.
So Flink is not just about processing data. It's about creating these whole new ways of interacting with the world around us.
You got it.
That's incredible. And speaking of interactive experiences,
Yes.
we want to make sure our listeners are feeling engaged with our podcast.
For sure.
So before we head to the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave us a comment.
Absolutely. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, what you found most insightful, what questions you still have, or even other topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes.
We love hearing from you.
And hey, if you're feeling generous, a like would be amazing.
Yes, it really helps.
It helps other people discover our podcast and join in on the conversation.
Exactly.
Awesome. All right, so let's move on to the last part of our deep dive where we'll talk about some of the ethical considerations when it comes to real-time data processing.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about how powerful and versatile Apache Flink is.
We have.
But you know what they say,
What's that?
with great power comes great responsibility.
Oh, for sure.
The Confluent video mentions some of the ethical stuff to think about when it comes to processing data in real time.
Right.
I think it's important to really dig into that a little bit more.
I agree.
Like, what are some of the things that we need to be careful about?
Well, real-time data processing opens up all these amazing possibilities.
It does.
But it also brings up some important questions about things like privacy, transparency, and accountability.
Okay.
For example, we talked about that retail store using Flink to analyze customer behavior.
Right.
How do they make sure they're not collecting or using that data in a way that violates people's privacy?
That's a really good point. And it's not just about privacy.
No.
There's also the issue of bias. If Flink is being used to make decisions that affect people's lives,
Right.
like whether they get a loan or a job, how can we be sure that those decisions aren't being influenced by biased data or algorithms?
Those are really important questions.
Yeah.
It's super important for developers and organizations that are using Flink to think about these ethical considerations and to build systems that are fair, transparent, and respect individual rights.
Absolutely.
That might mean using techniques to make data anonymous,
Right.
doing regular checks for bias, or even having humans involved in some of those decision-making processes.
That makes sense. It sounds like we need to have a much bigger conversation about all this.
I think so.
As real-time data processing becomes more common,
Definitely.
we can't just focus on efficiency and profits. We have to make sure we're using this technology responsibly.
I couldn't agree more. We need to be having open and honest discussions about these issues.
Yeah.
And not just with tech people, but with ethicists, policymakers, and the public, too.
It's got to be a collaborative effort.
It does. The future of real-time data processing depends on us finding a balance between innovation and responsibility.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We can't just assume that technology will magically fix all our problems.
Yep.
We have to be really thoughtful about how we design, implement, and manage these systems.
For sure.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Apache Flink.
It does.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
And as always, we would love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
What did you find most interesting?
Yeah.
What questions do you still have? What other topics would you like us to explore in future deep dives?
Let us know.
Yeah, hit that subscribe button and leave us a comment.
And if you're feeling really generous,
Yeah.
don't forget to give us a like.
It really does help more people discover our podcast and become a part of this awesome community.
We appreciate your support.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
See ya!